Hey everybody, it's good to see you. I'm Jane Woodward. We're going to talk about fossil fuels. All right, so big questions at the beginning of many of our lectures, certainly in mine. I just try and say, like, why are we here, even though we're going to dive into an enormous amount of minutia. So what's the impact of economic and technological changes on fossil fuel resources and reserves? When I tell people that 85% of all energy in the world in the US, más o menos, is coming from fossil fuels, they're shocked. They really have no idea how deeply embedded fossil fuels are in our energy system. And about 2/3, somewhere around 60% of all our electricity is coming from fossil fuels. It's hard to change that. And it's something, as much as we may not like fossil fuels, they're a huge part of our global energy system. And so it's important to understand them. What's the impact on environment and society? Considerations when we think about legacy. I like to make a distinction between what all the poop we inherited, this is the poop part, and we'll get, so we actually have to just, like, this is the legacy stuff that our parents left, my parents left me, and that I've left my kids. I have 3 young adult daughters. And then there's what are we going to do? So a really exciting thing today is we are actually going back to what I call legacy poop, like coal ash. And it's been this huge waste problem, and we're now mining it for battery metals. And the people that are doing that are cleaning up the problem of lack of regulation, because the coal industry was so good at keeping themselves from being regulated. But I think legacy poop is an important part about thinking about fossil fuels. Another aspect of fossil fuels is thinking about what are our choices today. And as we continue to use them, how can we use them in more efficacious ways, in ways where maybe we're managing the carbon impact or methane leakage and things like that. So legacy, current, and future environmental impacts. And how did we get here? You know, one quick statement to say is, I'm going to just tell you, I'm going to get it off my chest. Do you know what my favorite museum in the entire world is? I haven't been to that many museums, but my favorite museum is in Nantucket. It is the Whaling Museum. And people, has anybody been to Nantucket? So people go into that Whaling Museum and they say, wow, those people in Nantucket have a lot of money. They made this beautiful museum, and that's really cool technology that, you know, in 1850, you guys, our main source of energy to deliver the energy service of illumination was whale oil. And we got about 1/2% of the whale. We killed the whole whale to get about 1% of it to deliver whale oil so that we would have light. And men would go away for 2 or 3 years at a time and lose their lives to bring back a whale. Nantucket used to be a stinky mess. If you go there now, it's a resort. It's like a big, giant, beautiful, fun to visit country club. But when you go in that museum, what I see, because I'm an energy person, is I see the upstream of the harpoons they used to kill the whales. I see the midstream of all the exotic equipment. They went out of their way to build equipment to refine the whale oil. And then I see equipment they had to distribute it, the downstream part of whale oil. And then guess what happened? We found oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania, and then we didn't need whales anymore. So you look at the progression, you say, how did we get dependent on fossil fuels? Well, for a while, we were really dependent on whales, and we almost killed them all off, and we killed a lot of humans in the process. So it's really the words energy transition for a 39 forever person like me. It's like all of a sudden the words energy transition have been cool words to put together in the last 5 years, like it just happened. We just invented energy transition now. We have been transitioning of how we deliver illumination, mobility, heat, cooking, all those things. We've been transitioning that for a long time. So when we think about what's important, chemical energy is what you should think about. It's not nuclear, it's chemical. So it's the remains of plants, very small plants and animals, basically, but a lot of with gas. And with a lot of gas, not all gas, with coal, you should think of woody, peaty planting material. Imagine a bayou or a delta or something swampy. That's where that came from, right? And with oil, it's like, imagine that there's a big anoxic event in the atmosphere, like a volcanic eruption or a meteorite hits the Earth. And all of a sudden, all the oxygen goes out of the whole ecosystem of the Earth. Believe it or not, that happened in the past. And when all the algae and water systems died off when that happened, it created these layers in geologic time. I'm a geologist. In geologic time, you can see these layers and they're black. And it's this kerogen material, and that is where we get oil and we get some gas from that. So, but chemical energy is the key idea. You know, we're going to talk a lot about the history. we're going to raise the question and talk about the fact, I mean, my whole career, everybody's been like, oh my God, we're running out of oil. And then we developed horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. And we went from when I took this class, we were importing 2/3 of all our oil, to today we're the largest producer and consumer of oil and gas in the world. That's a pretty big change in 40 years, 45 years. So I think the big question with peak oil is when are we going to hit peak demand, right? That we hit peak demand for whale oil because oil came along and we got kerosene, and kerosene was better than whale oil for delivering the service of illumination. So we're switching from peak supply concerns of are we running out to like, as Sheikh Yamani, who was head of OPEC, said, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. We got smarter. We got something better. And so I think part of the reason I love teaching this class is we are making really good progress. It's just hard to move from 1% or 2% or 3% of the energy mix. It's hard to displace oil, gas, and coal because they have such a big share to start out with. So we talked about the organic origin. We've talked about that a bit. These are all depletable. They take millions, tens, hundreds of millions of years to make in the subsurface, but we combust them like that, okay? Super depletable fuels. And we burn them. That's the main way we use fossil fuels is we burn them, and we burn them very inefficiently, okay? So we have to do lots of work to get a simple thing. Amory Lovins, who hopefully most of you have heard of, and if you haven't, you will hear more about him. 45 years ago, when I first met him, he pointed out to me that for every gallon of gasoline in a car, 1% of the gasoline moves you, 13% moves the weight of the car, and all the rest is lost. That's kind of like killing the whale off so you can get 1% or half of 1% so you can, read at night. So this depletion, these issues around that, and the efficiency of how we combust fossil fuels is a long time topic that we are making progress on, but it's as one of my daughters says, it's a beautiful mess. So we have big externalities, again, this distinction, and they affect land use, air, water, solid waste. And there's the stuff you inherited, I inherited. There's what are we doing now on the margin, and how can we prevent things in the future? How do we pivot and still manage the present and clean up the past? So one of the things we're going to talk about is pretty damn confusing how people, when you read digital news, when you read news, understanding what the units are and how we describe things. Because a resource or a resource base is like, oh, this is what we think we have, versus proved reserves is what banks will treat as something on your balance sheet, like bricks of gold, okay? Except they're in the subsurface. So we're going to talk and give you some nomenclature, and that's true for all fossil fuels. So there's Dino. I lived with my grandparents, in Utah for a few years when I was young, and you'd get a gallon, you'd fill up your car with gas, and they'd give you those inflatable dinosaurs, and they put the dinosaurs, their logo, because everybody thought that's where oil came from at the time. So chemical energy, harnessed through combustion, depletable stock resource, okay? It's like, it's an inventory in the ground that's depletable. It's not like the sun that keeps shining or the wind that keeps blowing, etc. And they almost exclusively occur in sedimentary rocks. So this is enough to make people go, whoa, Jane just put this big pie chart up. But so the world's on the left and the US is on the right, and I want to own the fact many of you come from other countries besides the US, so I apologize for world in the US. Because a lot of other countries matter a lot, but we just, again, have limited time, and so it's contextualizing things. So you see that on a world and US basis, our fossil dependence very similar. We're a little more fossil-y outside the US because the US has invested more in natural gas, for instance, than the world at large. But this gives you a sense of the mix, and the numbers show you, it's just calling out what's number one. So number 1, 2, and 3, there you go in the world, and you compare number 1, 2, and 3. We're going to see in a moment. And look how close natural gas is getting in the United States to oil. So the role of oil, and natural gas 20 years ago was half of what it is today. So we've had a big burst in the role of natural gas and a pullback in the role of coal, largely in the electricity sector. So we haven't used, when I was growing up in California, oil was like 25% of our electric power mix. There's a really dumb way to generate electricity. There's a power plant called Moss Landing that now, it started out as oil. We built it for oil. Now it burns gas. And then we replaced some of it, and we had several versions of gas. Now we've replaced part of Moss Landing with big mega packs from Tesla, where we're just, using that location for energy storage. So this just gives you a sense that oil is really a transportation fuel. Coal is used almost exclusively for electricity, and natural gas we use for many things, largely in industry and largely for electric power generation, but natural gas is uniquely a very versatile fuel compared to many other things you're going to see in class. Okay, so I graduated in 1982. This is in quads, quadrillion BTUs. We've almost gone up 3x. And everybody's saying today, one of the biggest issues in the world today is we don't have enough energy, largely in the form of electricity. But there's a huge appetite for more energy. But this is fossil fuel production by country. Look what a big difference China's made compared to where it was 20 years ago. That's one of the biggest single blips. And where did a lot of that coal get used? It got used to generate energy to make things for us, because we outsourced a lot of our manufacturing to China. But that's where we are. That's what the mix is. Again, you're going to go through lots of slides. And then this is the Technicolor version of it as a pie chart. And it's showing production and consumption by country. So, key things is, which we'll talk about in a moment, this is all fossil fuels together. So China, US, Russia, 3 big countries. India is only 3%. But those 3 countries are the big fossil players in terms of production. And then consumption, it's China and the US. So, those 2 countries play a gigantic role in the economic health of the economy, the global economy, and they need the energy supplies to support it. Look how little Europe produces versus how much it consumes. That's a kind of interesting benchmark, and you see the dependence on imports there. So, and the war in the Ukraine has been a big story from a natural gas point of view, and it's led the US to displace Russia. So the Ukraine, for instance, Europe used to get a lot of natural gas from Russia, and because of the whole Ukrainian conflict, things have really shifted around there recently. So we're going to look at oil, gas, and coal in progression. So we can go back to when I was in school, way back here. I'm off the chart, but what's interesting is who knows why oil production has risen in the US? The advent of horizontal drilling. So the ability to steer a drill bit in the earth paralleled our ability to steer a drill bit in your body. So when I was growing up, if one of my dad's friends had stuff in his veins near his heart, you had to do open heart surgery. Now we do angioplasty. So it's the advent of computing technology that allows us to stick a drill bit in an artery in your leg and steer it up and go do roto-rooter near the heart and pull everything back out, and all of a sudden everything's fine, or to adjust things there. Our ability to steer a drill bit 8,000 feet down and then 15,000 feet laterally, hydraulic fracturing has been around for 80 years. So it was really the ability to drill horizontally that made the big difference. And so that's what we call tight oil or horizontally drilled oil, and we couldn't unleash those hydrocarbons because the permeability of the rock, the ability of hydrocarbons to flow, is too tight. So, but that's a pretty big change to go on in 20 years from where you look where oil was in the US and where it is today. So we're the largest producer and largest consumer in the world, and the thing we use oil most for is gasoline, okay? And other transportation fuels, but gasoline's number 1. So, and here's the role of natural gas. It's clicking for the same reason. In the case of natural gas, so I started investing in natural gas 45 years ago, and everybody thought I was crazy. But I saw something, which is what I call an innovation wave, where you get changes in technology, changes in policy, and changes in markets all at the same time. And natural gas had the advantage that it was really versatile to use. You could use it for many things. It had the disadvantage that it has a very low energy density, and you have to move it by pipeline or secondary by LNG, which is a little bit extra pain in the ass. So, but because we had that confluence of those 3 changes, we had really strangled regulation, and we opened it up. We released the regulation, these things happened, and the change in technology was really twofold. It was the horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, but it was also combined cycle gas turbines that allowed us to generate electricity almost twice as efficiently as a coal plant. So part of what killed coal and levitated natural gas was that big boost in efficiency of generation. As we're going to see in a minute, natural gas is by far the cleanest of the fossil fuels. You don't get coal ash with gas. You don't have, but the other issue with natural gas is if it leaks, it's 80 times more potent than CO2 in the atmosphere. So none of these are a free lunch, and they need to be managed very carefully. So here's China and coal, which they have a lot of. They're the largest producer and consumer, and they also import a lot because they consume so much they can't even produce enough coal domestically of the right quality to meet their needs. But that's kind of a landslide. Look at the rest of the world. And so this is another way to look at things and say, here's 5 countries that represent 46% of all fossil consumption. And it's interesting to me to notice how China and India are similar with a lot of coal, and the US and Russia are similar with a lot of gas. So each country, you have to kind of look at it and say they're not all like the other. They have different domestic resources they're leveraging. They have different strategic neighbors. And so looking at things on a country level is relevant. We don't always have time to do it in this class because we're operating up here, trying to give you the big picture. So this shows you, coming back to the United States, the history of coal. So look how natural gas killed coal. It really did. It's that simple because it was almost twice as efficient. Not quite twice, but it was a way better way to generate electricity. That's the biggest story, and it shows you natural gas is most likely, as we continue to decarbonize vehicle transport and electrify it, I think we're going to see gas pass oil, and oil is going to slowly decline. So we're going to see a boost in nuclear because there's just enormous pressure to bring green electrons on that are baseload power. And coal is going to, in spite of, literally, there's a federal order that to activate beautiful, clean coal in our country by Donald Trump, and it's very expensive, but it may rise a bit, but you can see coal is just not a big contributor to our energy mix in the US today. So if you're going to have fossil fuels, the argument was, and part of the reason I was comfortable betting on natural gas, I had to pick oil or gas because I had a mandate actually from a Stanford bequest at the time to buy mineral rights and royalty interests in either oil or gas, but I bet on gas because it's so much simpler and it's so much cleaner. The problem is if it leaks, you can't see it until like the last 5 years. We have a lot of satellites and drone and camera data, infrared cameras that allow us to see the leakage and manage it because no one who's producing natural gas wants to leak the gas. They would rather make money off it, but when you can't see something, it causes some environmental problems. So we call natural gas the prince of hydrocarbons because if we're not that fond of hydrocarbons as our long-term solution, hopefully it can be the bridge because it's flexible and it's cleaner than natural gas liquids, or sometimes these are called hydrocarbon gas liquids, oil or coal. Does anybody use a crock pot or something like that? That's what they called them when I was growing up. They're probably called something different now. But when you think of how do you make oil, gas, and coal, it's kind of the earth as a crock pot, meaning you end up with organic material in a natural surface location. In the case of coal, it's woody, peaty, planty material in a swamp. Like if you went to the Mississippi Delta today, there's other places you could go where it's swampy, out to the Baylands. It's a good example of it, maybe. But you need time, temperature, and pressure, okay? Lots of time. We're talking hundreds of millions of years in most cases. And high temperatures, high pressures. And to get oil, you need a period in geologic time where all these water systems were starved of oxygen and all this algae died off. And believe it, there's lots of people who are experts in this. We've had lots of them in Earth history. So that's basically the recipe for how you get oil and gas and coal. And then we burn it instantly, right? So, we've been digging up the earth, wells for oil and gas, and big shovels for coal. And in the coal lecture, you'll get some really great videos to watch and some slides to see that say, well, we're really good at that, at ripping up the earth. But the earth is the crock pot. And this shows, and natural gas has a couple origins. With oil, it's straightforward. It's single cell microorganisms, pretty well. Everybody's stacked hands. That's the story. Coal, everybody's stacked hands on that. Gas can come. Most gas, we say oil and gas like it's one word, most gas does not occur with oil. It occurs separately, and that natural gas has more of a biologic origin. Both coal and oil are complex, okay? Coal is really complex. And when it gets overcooked, methane breaks off. So part of the origin story of natural gas, really, and does anybody been to a coal mine? One of the biggest issues managing a coal mine is all the methane that's leaking out. Okay, so the source rock for a lot of natural gas is deeply buried coal beds, basically, and the methane's leaking out. But some some natural gas coexists with oil because the oil gets overcooked, and these molecules that you see for oil, CH4s, break off. So we have some reservoirs that are oil and gas mixes because the oil got overcooked and gas sits on the top of it, okay? And there's some situations this makes it very complicated. And there's a bunch of people, their whole career is about where did this come from? Where did the oil and gas come from? They call it hydrocarbon source rock geochemistry. In some cases, geologically, you had a source over here that was oil, which was single-cell microorganisms, and right nearby, you had a source of woody peaty planted material, and they all migrate through the reservoir to the same place. And then, so this keeps the chemists on their toes. I think for our purposes and all the good stuff we're going to cover today, the idea is think of a crock pot. That you need organic material, you need time, temperature, and pressure. The numbers around those are on here, and that is really the main story that you need to walk away from. It takes an enormously long time. And the big way we get the pressure and temperature, because you don't get to plug the earth in. So how do you get the temperature and pressure? It's putting more and more rock on top of the rock that has the organic material in it over time. And that's where you have to believe in something that got announced and invented and discovered and figured out again when I was in graduate school is plate tectonics. Okay? And plate tectonics is where you shove, you imagine here's the Earth's crust and it's in compression, and the Rocky Mountains are really the result of, buckling of the Earth, or in some places, and they call it thrust faults, where most of you have learned about this in science classes in high school. But if you push rock over another, go like this, then this part gets subducted. It gets put underneath, and that gets subjected to a lot of time, temperature, and pressure faster than if you just deposited the rock here and waited for more and more and more rock to get deposited on top of it. But that's why we have 20 to 500 million years is what it takes to make these hydrocarbons that we burn instantly as fuel. The main idea, the only thing I really need you to walk away from, is the idea there's something called hydrocarbon gas liquids that are often just called natural gas liquids. The nomenclature around this is confusing. All I care about is that you know that it exists. And this is a situation, and natural gas liquids, and they have all these cute little acronyms. It's like way too much information from my point of view. But they're not oil and they're not gas. They're in-betweeners. And they get used largely for the production of plastics and the production of propane, okay? And I think given all the time and all the cool stuff, we're going to leave it at that. This shows you what the mix is, and you're like, whoa, do I really care? I'm like, you don't really need to. But it's just we have to have, when we produce natural gas and there's no oil in it, but there are natural gas or hydrocarbons liquids in it, we have to pull those liquids off before we can move the gas into the pipeline. And those liquids have a high value because they often get made in a refinery out of the process of making gasoline from crude oil, right? So these are, if there are any chemical engineers in the stack, you're like, oh, Jane, I know this already. You don't need to tell me. But these are different factions. These are different hydrocarbons with different complexity to them that sit between gas, which is CH4, and crude oil, which is very complex. That's the main idea for you to know they exist. This is the geologic timescale, which many of us learned by elementary school, if not middle school, certainly by high school. The idea that the Earth is over 4 billion years old. And what this is meant to show you is when are the periods in the Earth's history where we had lots of swamps? Because that's where the coal is. Okay? And when were there periods of time where we had lots of anoxic events and big piles of algae got accumulated in the geologic record, which is where we find oil. When you're looking for oil and gas and coal, these are relevant things to understand, to be exploring when you're looking at layers of rock in the subsurface. When you take the Earth and you shrink the Earth's crust, which is where oil, gas, and coal are, we don't go into the mantle of the Earth. The mantle is liquid. It's very hot. It's very chemically rich. We don't drill wells into it. The average depth to oil and gas wells is about 8,000 or 9,000 feet. I think some of the deepest wells drilled on our in our Earth's crust are like 35,000 feet. So you think of a mile being a little over 5,000 feet. That puts it in context. So if you took the Earth and you shrunk the Earth to the size of this balloon, the Earth's crust is as thin as this balloon. Everything inside is molten, okay? So when you think, just for context, of what are we mining metals out of? What are we mining geothermal heat out of? What are we mining oil and gas out of? The Earth's crust is very thin. It's like a scab on a molten blob, right? So that crust, that is where we're getting our fossil fuels. And so it's just putting that in context because it's hard to visualize given what we do every day. And most of us, when we think of the Earth, we think of a trail we're going to hike on or the lawn we're going to mow or something like that. We don't think about the subsurface very much and what are these resources we're getting out. Okay, so plate tectonics. We got a little animation over here on the right. Remember, there used to be Pangea. It used to be one continent and it broke apart. And these plates are still the molten core of the Earth. Things are moving. You know, Carole King, I think, sang, "I feel the earth move under my feet." I think that's who sang it. It is moving, and just very, very slowly on a human scale, but not relative to fossil fuels that took 20 to 500 million years to form. And so an interesting thing is that where the oil, gas, and coal is today on the globe is not necessarily where the hydrocarbon material was deposited in the beginning, because this is moving around. So as a geologist, you have to do time lapse in your head and say, okay, where was the ancient ocean or the ancient swamp, and how did that all fit together? Okay, resources, reserves, they'll last forever. The sad thing is when I took this class 45 years ago, there was a huge scarcity mindset. We had plenty of fossil fuels. And if we use them all, we will completely fry our planet, okay? So running out is not the issue. So, but when we talk about reserves, there was a dude named McKelvey at the US Geological Survey, and he came up with this idea of how do we describe anything in the ground? It could be lithium, it could be coal, it could be gold, any stock resource in the ground. How do we think about it? So the idea of a resource base is it's the best estimate. If you did not drill one well, it's just pulling the smartest people together and say, what's our best guess of what's in the Earth? That's our resource base. It has nothing to do with economic feasibility or technological feasibility. It's just like, what do we got here? Then we put a layer on it. We say, okay, what's the technically recoverable resources? So resources do not imply economic viability yet, okay? Then you say reserves, okay? So when you get to reserves, that's when the SEC and others are like paying attention to how much gold or lithium or coal or oil and gas you have. It's like, oh, you're calling these reserves. That means they can be profitably recovered at today's prices and with today's technology. Is everybody following? Today's prices and today's technology. But we still haven't drilled a well yet, necessarily. We still haven't tested it. So your proved reserves is where we actually can point to it and say, yep, it's there, we've tested it, we have really third-party, independently verifiable evidence that these are like gold bricks in the ground, right? All we have to do is pull them up the wellbore or scoop them out with a shovel, in the case of coal. Okay, so that's what the SEC cares about. That can be on a balance sheet or your proved reserves or whatever is in the Earth's crust that you're claiming has economic value. So an important thing to think about is how do these change? What happens if the price goes up? Let's say it's coal. If the price of coal goes up 20%, what happens to the proved reserves? Greater, yeah. Same way, if the price falls down, then you have fewer proved reserves, because if the price of coal fell in half, then because there's a cost to getting the coal out of the ground, it means your margins to get the coal out, a bunch of coal would not be economic if the price fell, right? If your technology improves, like horizontal drilling, you know, all of a sudden your proved reserves can really change, or your reserves can really change till you actually drill and prove it there, or a discovery is made, that can really increase these numbers. And so paying attention to if a price goes up or down, or if there's a technology breakthrough, that has ramifications for a company or a country that controls a resource, whatever it might be. Hopefully that makes sense. So one of the things people have tracked for a long time is they say, okay, what are the proved reserves of things, but you could have gold, lithium, nickel on here too. What are the proved reserves, and then how much do we produce? And the reserves to production ratio is how long will it last us. So at today's levels of production, and at that amount of reserves, and if we kept using the same amount but we didn't find anything new, how long would it last us? Does that make sense? So it says that these numbers tend to stay the same, meaning we're not running out of any of them because we keep finding enough, or the technology improves so we have a higher recovery level. The recovery in an oil and gas reservoir of the oil and gas out of it is typically less than a third of what's in place. These pore spaces that the oil and gas in are teeny weeny weeny. And so those big fat molecules, certainly when it comes to oil, they just can't move through them very well. And we go to great lengths to try and push more out, but it's hard to boost the recovery levels. So here's proved reserves of oil. So ironic, you look at the proved reserves of oil over on the left, and there's the United States. We have 4% of the proved reserves of oil. And do you remember what I just told you? We're the largest producer in the world, but we only have 4% of the reserves. Why do you think we're the largest producer in the world? We have a democracy, we have technology, we have private ownership of the mineral rights. Almost every country in the world, the government owns the subsurface. We have private ownership, so individuals and corporations can say, let's exploit it without giving the government's permission except for environmental concerns. So we're the most entrepreneurial, for better or for worse, about getting stuff out of the ground of any country in the world, so we can have a very small amount of proved reserves, but still be supplying the world and ourselves with a lot of oil. So here's the gas story. So half of the world's gas reserves are in 3 countries. Again, we only have 7%, but we're the largest producer and the largest consumer in the world. And it's showing you, I'm going to go back here for a minute, on oil. So Texas is huge. North Dakota used to be like nothing, and New Mexico was like nothing. And it's horizontal drilling. Those are the 2 states besides Texas where a lot of oil has been brought online in the Williston Basin of North Dakota. And New Mexico, it's on something called the Permian Basin, is on straddles New Mexico and Texas, and it's the largest producing tight oil play in the world. So it's been very, very prolific. Kind of, I just went to Climate Week. A kind of fun outcome for me is New Mexico is getting the state is getting a lot of royalty income from oil production. They're turning around and they're using a lot of the money they're getting to host first-of-a-kind projects to be built, fusion reactors, all kinds of stuff. They're like, come to New Mexico. We have all this money as a state and we have a pretty small population. So they're using their oil revenue to do some pretty cool things. So here's natural gas, and you see the important states, Pennsylvania. So shale gas revolution in Pennsylvania, very transformative, 28 times growth in Pennsylvania in the last 20 years or so. Texas is the big, so when you think of gas and oil, think Texas as number 1 in the US, but only a very small part of the proved reserves. And a lot of it has to do with our semi-free democracy and capitalistic system we have today. I'm not trying to say anything political. I'm just trying to talk about what's going on. So this shows you coal, and we have a lot of coal, but we don't use a lot of coal. And it shows you the states that have a lot of coal. Most people don't know how much Montana has. It has a lot. And our history, you're going to have a whole lecture on coal. Our history of coal development was really in Appalachia and ripping up the earth from the surface and subsurface. So all those coal miners down in tunnels and things like that. And it turns out the coal geologically out in Wyoming and Montana is low sulfur coal. It's better coal for the atmosphere when we burn it. And so the Clean Air Act really shifted where we mine coal to the west when it used to be in Appalachia. So environmental impact. I think a lot of people are attracted to energy as a topic because they know this. And they know they don't want to see the proliferation of these environmental impacts. And they're excited and hopeful that we will have renewable technologies, because it's really technologies that allow us to harness kind of infinite resources like the sun and the wind and the heat of the earth, right? So a difference between fossil fuels is we're combusting a resource. In the case of the wind and the sun and the heat of the earth, we're not combusting those, we're not splitting those. We're just using a technology to harness them without impacting how much of them there is, if that makes any sense. And so the fact that we have to work so hard with fossil fuels leads to these kinds of impacts, which I think a lot of the reason people want to understand energy is they want energy services. We all want them for ourselves so that we can be as productive as possible. We want them for people who don't have access to them today so that they have light for literacy and they don't have to go hunt and go gather wood to be able to cook dinner. We want beneficial energy, but we don't want these impacts. So this is just profiling those. And reminding everybody something you may already know, and Kirsten Stasio may have talked about it, which is the idea that, our greenhouse gases are not the same. They have different durations and they have different impacts on the atmosphere. And so since they're so integrally tied to our fossil fuels, this is a really important thing when we talk about the environmental impact. This is looking at global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions and how they've risen during a 22-year period of time by about 25% or more, and shows you the components of where they come from. Coal obviously is big, oil's big, flaring is not that big in there. So, and then methane leakage. And methane is something that I feel like the tools that we have today to see things we couldn't see before is really helping us. Another interesting thing that in a world where a lot of people think our president controls everything, so we are exporting a lot of natural gas right now. Well, Engie in France is saying, yeah, we want to buy your natural gas. We want LNG, but we want you to certify that there has not been leakage on the pipelines, on the system. And so that is putting more pressure on producers to adopt those tools and technologies than our own EPA is putting. Our regulation is not as tight as it could be, but the fact that we're a global player in the gas business and our customers want certified gas, that's helping us raise our game. So I am happy to see that because I care a great deal about methane emissions. So this is just another look at how fossil emissions have been growing. If you go all the way back to 1860, we really only started using fossil fuels, in the kind of our whole industrial revolution. So this is a bit redundant, but it's talking about the carbon majors and their role, how many companies, how many states, how many producing entities. When you get down to say, who do we go after to try and influence them and hold them accountable, this is kind of giving you a sense of the population of folks that are worth paying attention to. This is another way of looking at things too and saying, half the world's CO2 emissions are coming from 36 fossil fuel firms, and then showing you regionally where the biggest emissions are coming from. This is just 2024. And so, the US looks like it's North America, not as bad, but when you look at our past, it's a different story. Another way, and there's a top contributors over there on the right, it's all that coal. So I really like this slide. If if I was going to trim some slides, which might be a good idea. So here's annual emissions. That shows you how polluting coal China is with all the coal it's burning to make things for us to import, is where things have been up until recently. And the United States is actually making progress, you see, on its emissions because of things that states like California have done and a lot of federal policy that was very productive. But then if you look at the cumulative emissions, the US is still the cumulative offender for greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And so we have to take both those things into account when we come up with global policies and we try and decide, who needs to own what in terms of what's going on. We didn't even have a lot of this data. It wasn't being shared. This is methane tracking. This is looking, we can dial in and see the role of the upstream methane emissions. So you see, and coal. So you can see that oil and gas upstream is the primary culprit. So just having, this is a new slide. We didn't have this last year. So the level of transparency that's being created about this is excellent because then it allows some finger pointing and some let's go guys, let's clean this up. This is all human emissions and the role of fossil fuels in that mix. So again, I apologize for the numbing number of slides. This is, there's the poop, see up at the top. That's why we have so this is, we're making some progress that 5 years ago I didn't think we would make, which is people are finding there's valuable stuff in the poop. And so the deal is we'll clean up the poop if we can have the valuable stuff out of it. So we have a lot of Superfund sites. This is what you all inherited from my generation and the 3 or 4 above me. We have a bunch of coal ash pits, ponds, and landfills that nobody's taking good care of. We have a bunch of abandoned coal mine sites that everybody's oh well. The problem is it rains. The coal has half the periodic table in it and it all goes into water systems, and that is bad. And a lot of these abandoned coal mines are in poor neighborhoods with people that can't defend themselves or measure or go argue on their own behalf. We have 25 oil refineries. Diana's going to talk more about refining and what's going on there. They've just been abandoned. The companies who operated them don't exist anymore. So they're like, our country owns them. And they're a big, fat mess. And then we have, this is something I spend a fair bit of time on, is looking at how can we manage old oil and gas wells. The way we drill for oil and gas today is really good, honestly. It's really good. Shit can still happen, but it's really good. The big issue is the way we did it prior to 20 or 30 years ago. And so those practices were not at the standard we have today. And there are a lot of legacy issues. So this is showing coal waste pile, what it looks like near a community. And this is showing how regulation varies from administration to administration and the progress that we've made in the electric power sector reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And this shows the conflict that if you transition away from fossil fuels, you have to come up with new economic drivers, because this is revenue that governments get from oil and gas. So they use that for their own coffers, to provide infrastructure to communities. So if you're going to remove oil and gas, what are you going to give communities in exchange and governments? How are they going to profit from whatever's next? And this shows local government, just in the United States, by state, how local governments are dependent on different sources of energy. And so you see oil and gas in blue. A lot of states are making a lot of money off oil and gas. There's something called severance taxes. There's a variety of taxes that states get from oil and gas production, and they're not getting them from geothermal or nuclear or other things in the same way. So it's important to look at the whole system in terms of thinking about where we are. And so this idea, this is from McKinsey, most of you have heard of, and this is this whole idea of when are we going to have peak demand? When are we going to start saying we're going to really electrify transportation? We're going to electrify we're going to electrify things, and we're going to use the wind and the sun and geothermal and nuclear rather than fossil fuels. So we don't know the answer to that. We just know that there's things, the growth rate for oil, gas, and coal globally is flat to like 2%. The growth rate, compound annual growth rate for solar is like 25%, but it's starting at a very small point. I took 10 minutes longer than I meant to, but I still went too fast, and I apologize to just go back to where we started, which is chemical energy, a lot of history. We're going to talk more about the history, actually. When we talk about peak oil, peak coal, peak gas, is it about how much we have? No, it's about, it's a peak demand story. And I think there's a lot of evidence that China is working really hard to become less dependent. They're the largest manufacturer of solar, wind, batteries, and EVs in the world by a gigantic margin. Gigantic margin. They are working really hard to electrify. But in the meantime, there's a lot of coal that they're using to make everything that they make. All the fossil fuels are depletable. All of them have a lot of impacts. And we got to think about how we describe them in terms of resource versus reserves, and are they proved or not. And with that, I'm going to take a bow.
If you want to learn more about this topic or other energy topics, visit our Stanford Understand Energy Learning Hub for free resources, including signing up for our monthly Energy Spotlight. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and tap the notification bell to be notified for our newest content.